Dear participants, hi, this is Professor Dr. Tuğba Karabulut. I am the head of Department of Business Administration, Istanbul Ticaret University, and I'm here for almost 20 years. Today, I'm very happy to host dear Professor Scott Stern. He's with us, and we'll be talking about entrepreneurial strategy, emerging lessons and findings. I would like to thank to my university, my rectors, my dean and vice rectors to give me this opportunity to make this webinar. Basically, I'll be more than happy to also ask questions to our guest, and of course, he's going to make a great presentation. Welcome, Professor Stern. Hi, welcome.
Very, very good. And first, I want to thank Professor Karabulut. I think I almost got it right, maybe not so much. And for all of you for joining, and feel free, I have my chat up. So if you just throw comments into the chat, I'm happy to answer as we go, or just raise your hand, or we look like a pretty modest sized group. So even if you just kind of come on in and ask me a question, I'm sure we can make it. As Tugba noted as we were starting, so first, thank you for including me in this. And as Tugba was starting, she noted that I had 119 slides, and believe it or not, I could add many more, but we're not going to go over all of them. I think I'm going to kind of skip around here. I was trying to figure out exactly how to position this, and now, particularly now that I understand, so this is kind of most of the people here are included in your class. Is that right?
I mean, actually, we are in the entrepreneurship class right now, and students are here, so we are very happy to host you right now.
Yeah, perfect. Great. That sounds fantastic. So, my name is Scott Stern, and I'm a professor at MIT Sloan. And one of the things that I have been working on for the last decade, or even actually in the research side for 2 decades, is really trying to bring together. Right. So if these are, MBAs, or if you're undergraduates, you're trying to bring together different parts of this, is on the one hand, the field of strategy, the field of how we make choices and the consequence of those choices for our firms, and the field of entrepreneurship, how we pursue opportunity in the absence, in advance of resources currently under our control. And it turns out that sometimes even those of you who might even kind of go out and be involved in startups or be studying them, very often, when we think about that, there's kind of a real tension between whether or not the tools of business administration, the department, are appropriate for startups, or what is a useful framework for startups, for entrepreneurs to pursue and make strategic choices that allow them to create and capture value. And so to sort of start that discussion, I'm going to start with a little example. So here is these 2 students walked into my office almost a decade ago now, Michael Martin and Nick Korolick. Michael was actually an MBA at the Harvard Business School. He actually had a private equity background. And Nick Korolick was actually in our nuclear engineering department, which you might say is a kind of he's pretty teched up. And Mike and Nick were pursuing the idea of mobile first emergency response. So if you kind of think about in the US, we call that 911. I'm not sure what it's called in Turkey, but if you think about emergency response, very often there was an extensive system to tell us where the location of an individual was. If they called from a landline phone, probably no one here even uses a landline phone anymore, right? On the other hand, we all have these mobile phones that are also taking our pulse and kind of know who we are, know exactly who we are, but that's how we get our Ubers and Lyfts. But interestingly, all of that data wasn't being transferred to the emergency response sector, right? So big opportunity. They weren't the first people to discover it. They had made, Nick in particular, had made some progress in understanding it one particular way, at least to solve a little bit of it. Michael had undertaken some very extensive primary market research. So I'm sure, you encourage people to talk to customers, kind of understand use cases. He had actually visited 300 different public safety answering stations, kind of 911 centers across the the United States rather than go back to his job in finance. And so then the question was, they had a good understanding of customer and the institutions. They had some technology. What should they do? Right? Once I tell you, let's do mobile first, 911, right? You could probably, if you want, just throw it into the chat, right? You could almost immediately think of many directions that you could go. You could work with existing players in the industry. That industry tends to be dominated by a big company called Motorola, right? They control a lot of the infrastructure. So you could work with them. Actually, they got some calls from insurance companies who wanted kind of this to be kind of some value-added piece on their app. They went out to Silicon Valley to kind of talk to venture capitalists. And the VCs were like, let's completely get rid of the government in this space, and we'll kind of create a private solution. We'll kind of completely create a new architecture, a new platform, and then sell those services back to government. In the fourth, right, they were hearing from all sorts of people from particular communities that really care about emergency response. People, for example, domestic violence organizations or epilepsy organization or American Heart Association. And what's interesting is I hope you kind of probably agree with me that, right, this might be a very good opportunity to pursue, but it's not clear what direction to go. And in some sense, that's at the essence, I think, of many of the challenges that entrepreneurs face. The problem is they can't, right? If you're pursuing entrepreneurship, it's not that you can't figure out what to do, it's that you can think of too many things to do. You can see many paths forward, and none of them are guaranteed to work. And so the question is how to kind of navigate among those choices and formulate and implement an overall entrepreneurial strategy. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you, right? Once again, I have an infinite number of slides because there's nothing like a pandemic to write a textbook. So I'll talk to you about that in just a little bit. Okay? So just to kind of go back, let me just kind of write, and particularly, right, if these are, mostly, right, and, right, we're all in a business school here, right? Business schools and entrepreneurship kind of get along, schools of commerce. But it's kind of interesting when you think about the advice we get, the advice we give and the advice we get. And when you think about it, there's basically two types of advice that we tend to either give or receive. The first is what I call action. So here's Richard Branson, right, kind of born on third, but ran home. If you're looking to become an entrepreneur, don't waste your time going to university or business school. This would be bad for us, Tugba. Just get on and do it. But I'll note that he doesn't tell you the it to do, right? It's like you already know what to do. You need a little kick in the pants. And, as a father of some teenage sons, sometimes just do your algebra homework, do your calculus homework. That's just the exact advice you need. Just do it. There's a second type of advice, and when you think about it, probably most of your courses within a commerce school or business administration, that's what they are, is planning. We develop frameworks that allow us to weigh the benefits and costs of alternative options. We have spreadsheets, we have data, right? And we identify what's the best path forward. We optimize. And so when you think about it, right, both of these are different approaches to entrepreneurial decision-making and strategy. And so some of you will recognize some of the people here. These are, whether or not in practice, people like Eric Ries in the Lean Startup, right? Or Israel Kirzner, the great, kind of old, right, kind of, lion of entrepreneurship research. Or in the planning side, you have people like Mike Porter or David Teese, kind of big picture thinkers with kind of very extensive frameworks that assume you can weigh costs and benefits, right? Right? Weigh costs and benefits. Right? But when you think about it, neither of those approaches quite gets at the nature of how entrepreneurs get advice, but even more importantly, how they make decisions. So we have a television. Do you have this program in Turkey, right? called Shark Tank? Do you have Shark Tank?
No, we don't have it. No.
But you know what it is, right? Does everyone know what that is? Right? So there's a show where an entrepreneur comes on, they talk to all the sharks have different perspectives. And what's interesting is this is like almost like,
We had Dragon's Den.
Your Devil's Den. Same.
Dragon's Den. We had Dragon's Den in the past, Turkish version.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So when you think about it, these are, of course, that show is entertainment, but it captures a very important part of entrepreneurship, which is, guess what? People see exactly the same information, and they give very different answers. Different of the devils or the dragons or the sharks give different answers to the entrepreneurs, different pieces of advice. And you might say, oh, that's kind of obvious. Of course, different people have different perspectives, but not on your exam, right? When you take an economics course, there's one answer that's right. And so is it just that some of these people are wrong? No, right? Is that there's a different kind of decision-making that we're talking about. And it turns out if we can kind of center that different kind of decision-making, the process of entrepreneurial choice, take that very seriously, it turns out to open up new perspectives on practical tools for entrepreneurs, how to conduct research around entrepreneurship, and has implications for entrepreneurial strategy and performance. Okay, so let me kind of, right? So I'm gonna skip over a bunch of things, right? Oh, okay, here we go, right? So let me start with, in some sense, what we usually say about this kind of environment. And I'll kind of highlight one or two very quick pieces of research. But is that in some sense, you as an entrepreneur, very often this is what the kind of knowledge we give students, is basically you find yourself up here at the top and you are in some sort of environment. You as the entrepreneur are pursuing an opportunity, and there's some environment for commercialization, for how much you might disclose, for financing, there's some kind of environment that's, who the big players are, okay? And in particular, that if you are in an environment where there's a market for that you are able to pursue cooperative routes with big players, you might be able to participate in what we call the market for ideas or market for technology. And then that, right, means you're not actually competing with those big players, but you're cooperating with them. And that might actually reinforce kind of existing market structure. When you even think about in the United States today, a lot of the big tech firms acquire a lot of their potential competitors. That's because there's this market for technology, market for ideas, and that reinforces the dominance of the larger firms. Okay, and so the kind of logic here is there's a fixed environment that has consequence for your strategic choice here, whether or not to participate in the market for ideas, and then that has implications for market performance. In the interest of, we have lots and lots of material, so I promise you I'll send a big long slide deck along. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of sharpen this just a little bit, okay? And so in particular, right, is one way, that we did research in this area, right? So I've done a lot of research, is we thought about, in particular, what role does formal intellectual property play? And one insight you could get with that kind of environmental approach is that by addressing the disclosure problem, if you can get effective intellectual property, that allows you to trade in this market for ideas. It sort of shifts your optimal choice one way rather than the other. And so it enhances cooperative commercialization between startup innovators and established firms. And so just to kind of give you a little bit of a way of thinking about that, we could even have a little framework that sort of tells you, right? And let me even better here, right? This is when we're very junior. This is my work with Joshua Gans and some other co-authors, right? Is that depending on the environment you're in, if you know that you're in pursuing an opportunity that you're overturning the incumbent asset value and it's a non-excludable technology, so for example, that upper left here, then that's the attacker. Actually, let's do it this way, right? That's the attacker's advantage. And that has lots of consequences for your strategy, lots of consequences for the established firm strategy, and lots of consequences for how the market will evolve over time. Everyone so far so good on that? So we're doing okay? Yeah, great.
Yes.
And then, so on and so forth. And of course, not surprisingly, once you're in this kind of mood that there's this environment out there, you know what your environment is, you find out what environment you're in, you pursue your strategy, then you can kind of iterate that over time. There's some great work on understanding the dynamics of commercialization strategy. There's a great paper by Josh Gans, David Chu, and Matt Marks, where they look at sort of how do people pivot over time based on changes in their environment. So that what in particular they show is they compete through disruption and they cooperate over time. But that's one of the bigger strategies we see in the industry they looked at, which was the voice recognition industry. Okay. Right. Interestingly, though, so let me do it this way, right? Interestingly, though, that framework, right? So just to kind of, I know you guys coming from a bunch of different perspectives, but that framework is very baked into the kind of teaching, the kind of research, the kind of advice we give to practitioners in traditional businesses and perhaps in entrepreneurship. But I would sort of kind of suggest to you that kind of framework is not so helpful for Michael and Nick, and they're choosing to pursue an opportunity in emergency response. Because half the problem is they don't know what environment they're in, and their choices, if they go to the right or to the left, if they choose to work with Motorola or the insurance companies, or try to displace Motorola or work with the burning platform users, such as epilepsy, those are very different paths for the firm. And each of those different paths has consequences for how they build their company. And so that one insight is at the heart of our work around entrepreneurial strategy. So as I kind of hinted to Tugba earlier, there's nothing like a pandemic to write a textbook that's coming out January 1st. So Tugba, if you're at all interested, we literally have a textbook coming out January 1st that's been used in hundreds of classrooms around the world. We have a ton of material. I'll sort of introduce you to some of that material right here. This is with my great co-authors and collaborators, Aaron Scott, who's here at Sloan with me, as well as Joshua Gans. And at the core of our frame are sort of three insights, and they only take 4 words. Choice matters, right? Kind of, right? The directions we take, the paths we choose matter as entrepreneurs in consequential ways. That, of course, right? We love the process of learning and experimentation. We love iterating. We love pivoting, right? But there are some critical choices. These choices matter. Our choice of first customer, our choice of technology, our choice of organization, our choice of how to commercialize. And then those choices come together. These choices matter together as part of an overall entrepreneurial strategy. So I said before, there were these kind of 2 different types of advice you get: action and planning. And I wanted to kind of be clear about what they solve for, because let me go, they're both incredibly valuable. So action-oriented advice is really helpful when there's one optimal path forward, when you kind of know what to do and you need a little bit of a kick in the pants. Planning type advice, those types of frameworks, very detailed cost-benefit analysis, is very valuable when you can apply cost-benefit analysis before you have to make a decision, when you can undertake the analysis without making any commitments. But what happens as an entrepreneur when you face the following conditions? On the one hand, you can see multiple paths forward. You have some freedom. So you can see multiple ways to potentially go, none of which is guaranteed. We're entrepreneurs, so we don't have resources or time. Some of these paths are strategically inconsistent, so we're constrained. We can't pursue all the paths at the same time. Each path is uncertain, and moreover is also telling us a little bit about, are we in a fertile area, as well as about our strategy. So we might have uncertainty that doesn't kind of allow us to do a single test that decides thing, But when we get actually good news or positive feedback, that might induce additional search. And moreover, though we're getting feedback from our learning and experimentation, it's still pretty noisy and doesn't quite allow us to distinguish between the precise value of one path versus the precise value of others. And so at the core of entrepreneurship is people who face options. They can't do them all of the options. They're not some big corporation that can, have a team A, team B, team C, team D. They face uncertainty. They're searching around using learning and experimentation, but the learning itself is noisy. And so the question is, how do you make good decisions, impactful decisions under those conditions? How do we resolve what we call the paradox of entrepreneurship? That we have to undertake learning and experimentation in order to understand the value of alternative strategic commitments. But the very process of learning and experimentation partially commits us along some paths over others. And so that's been at the core of the approach that we've tried to pursue. And once again, in a series of both research articles, in a bunch of work that we do in our classrooms, and as well a wide variety of work with literally thousands, imagine tens of thousands of startups in a wide variety of contexts. So just kind of one piece, and I think we might have sent this along, was this work with Jane Wu and Josh Gans that was the Strategic Management Journal called The Foundations of Entrepreneurial Strategy. And I just want to kind of bring us through that decision problem just a little bit. So I want to kind of go a little, and talk about this is helpful, right? Kind of going through this a little bit and then drawing out some implications. That sounds like a good way to go. So what are we going to do? First, hold on, I'm less clear. First, freedom. So when you are pursuing an entrepreneurial opportunity, there's more than one path to create and capture value from that idea. So for example, the man on the left, the gentleman on the left, is Howard Schultz. And in the United States, he's pretty well known as an entrepreneur. He's considered the founder of Starbucks. But he actually wasn't the founder of Starbucks. He was actually an early employee of Starbucks, which was founded by the gentleman on the right, that kind of group of three men. And their entrepreneurial insight was very simple. This is all the way back in the 1970s. At that time, American coffee was terrible. It was really bad, right? For those of you, if you've ever come to the US, right, you agree even today, American coffee is not so great. And so their idea was to bring European-style coffees to the United States. And so they built little shops called Starbucks. There had three of them when they hired Howard Schultz. And then Howard Schultz was actually on a buying trip in Milan, in Italy. And he had an insight that people, and so the business model that's that the original founders of Starbucks had was, what they did is they would import coffee beans. They would sell the beans in these bags at a very high margin. They would teach people how to make them, and people would make high quality European coffees at home, kind of French roast or whatever it would be. Okay. Howard Schultz was on a buying trip in Milan when he saw another path. For basically the same insight, American coffee was terrible. He realized that another thing you could do is you could open a cafe. So he went to the founders of Starbucks. He said, listen, I love this. I think we're on the right opportunity. We're pursuing a really good area, which is improving American coffee. But why don't we actually try out, do a little experiment to see if this other path, this cafe idea, might also work. And the founders of Starbucks said, no, we're already too busy. We're barely surviving right now. We're very constrained. What are you talking about? But then they actually went out of town. And Howard Schultz literally did an experiment where he opened a small cafe in one of the shops. And by the end of 2 weeks, people loved it. There was a line around the block. You had to wait an hour, right, in line. Founders of Starbucks come back. Howard Schultz looks at them and says, oh my goodness, I I told you, you know what I'm saying? I'm asking forgiveness, not permission. I pursued this entrepreneurial test. I now have the data. This cafe concept totally works. And then the founders of Starbucks promptly fired him. They said, how dare you make our core customers who are paying huge margins for the bags of beans wait in line for an hour while you serve up somebody a Frappuccino. And so then Howard Schultz actually opened up his own cafe, Il Giornale, and 2 years later bought the brand name and the logo of Starbucks from the original founders. And then he kind of built out that cafe-oriented version of Starbucks over time. And most people who hear this story, they're like, oh my goodness, these guys on the right, what a bunch of losers. Biggest loss in history. Well, actually, that's the team that scaled Peet's Coffee, which became the other big chain in the United States. Not quite as big as Starbucks, but a multi-billion-dollar firm. In other words, and they stuck true to their vision of mostly being about the coffee beans and taking it home and so on and so forth, while Starbucks was more about the cafe. There really was a good idea. American coffee really was terrible, probably still is. And there were multiple versions of that idea that could work, but you could not pursue all of them at the same time. And that leads us to our second condition, constraint. The main reason, of course, that entrepreneurs are constrained, I'm sure you do this in class, the main reason is that we don't have enough time, enough resources. Even more so, right, or equally so, it's hard to do them strategic. There's the need for strategic consistency across choice. So there's Anita Roddick, the founder of The Body Shop. And her core insight, she was actually an entrepreneur almost by accident. She had small children at home. Her husband decided to go off on an adventure in South America for a year. She's like, I need to make a living. And she was actually the entrepreneur who recognized there was a difference between the beauty industry, kind of thing like Estee Lauder or kind of traditional cosmetics, the beauty industry, which was like looking good for men, and the care industry, which is having confidence in yourself. And she didn't invent that concept. It kind of had been around, but that was the thing she understood. That was her entrepreneurial insight, was that there was a business to be had in the care industry. And so she found very unusual products, all natural and organic, no animal testing, very ethical kind of treatment. And once again, it was all about giving women confidence. And what's interesting is people love this. She found a good beachhead market. She started scaling. And then she got advisors. She actually got investors. And all the investors came from the beauty industry. And guess what they told her? They're saying this was all very nice and good, but now if you really want to scale, you're going to need to do animal testing, use chemicals, and you're going to have to serve the customers who care about beauty rather than care. And she looked at them and she actually fired them from the board. She actually changed things around because she said, even if I have the time and resources to do that, I can't be true to being the Body Shop and being true to being that other path as well. Do you see what I'm saying? So in other words, once again, you're sort of constrained in your choices. And so that's actually should tell you something, right? So you have lots of options. You can't do them all. And so that tells you that unless you want to kind of be searching around forever, you need some sort of stopping rule or choice rule. But then the problem is you face a lot of uncertainty. And that uncertainty is really kind of a little subtle because you're right, as an entrepreneur, you're both trying to figure out, is my core idea good? Is it a good idea to go after mobile 911 or the care industry versus the beauty industry or the understanding, making American coffee better, whatever your example would be. But as well, I'm trying to figure out what to do. Which market should I enter? How should I enter it? How should I organize my team? And so the entrepreneurs are uncertain not only about the value of their idea, but the sort of the distribution of the value of alternative strategies for that idea. That actually has a kind of relatively subtle effect, which is that if you don't know if you're in a good or a bad idea space, when you get good news, that's not right. So sometimes if you say, oh, I found a good customer. That's immediately reason to just do that. But if you're uncertain about, are you in a good space? Are you pursuing a broadly good opportunity? When you find somebody who's willing to pay you, you might say, oh my goodness, if the first person I talk to loves this, maybe I should search around a little bit more. Right? Here's Jeff Bezos. He was literally working in the finance industry in the early 1990s. And his boss, D.E. Shaw, right, had a hedge fund, literally looked at him and said, it was a long time ago, he's like, we're in the finance industry. There's this new thing called the internet. I would like to figure out if the internet is going to impact finance. That was literally the assignment. And he gave him 2 weeks. And Jeff Bezos was very, very smart. And literally in 2 weeks, he came back with basically a business plan in which he, for something like almost like what we call an E-trade today, but absolutely that created, right? He's like, oh my goodness, the internet's growing a huge amount. It's going to obviously impact finance. And there's lots of businesses that you can, right there, you can obviously have a very successful business in finance that leverages the internet. And you might say, oh, that's great. That's what you should do. But then Jeff Bezos said to himself, actually, if the first industry I looked at, the first vertical I looked at for understanding the impact of the internet is such a moneymaker, I should actually look at others as well. And he actually wrote more than 20 different business plans for different verticals, for finance, for music, for toys, for clothing, for electronics, and of course, for books. And he chose books, right? And he kind of became enamored. He didn't invent the concept, but sort of he popularized the concept of e-commerce, right? In which what he was trying to do was kind of maximize the number of items he could make available online versus the number that were available in a physical store. That kind of makes sense. And so there's kind of an insight there, right? You might be very tempted as an entrepreneur that once you find your first plan that works, you just do that, right? On the other hand, and can you guys still hear me? I'm just trying to understand. Can you hear me? Great. Okay. Yeah, perfect. Absolutely. Okay, great. Okay, great. Right? You might be very tempted to sort of say, oh my goodness, this is like, this is a great opportunity to just do that, to do the first plan. But Jeff Bezos and other entrepreneurs as well, they understand that if the first thing you try looks really good, that tells you that you're in a really interesting space. Areas today like large language models, chatbots, right? It's not clear who's going to win. And just doing the first thing that comes to your mind, even though it might be good on its own terms, may not be the path to pursuing the most impactful version. Say, okay, sure, I'll go search around and I'll find the right solution. Except the last part is, this kind of learning is extremely noisy, right? You're going to be limited. And very often what you're learning more about is identifying a bunch of paths that might work, but less so learning exactly what will work. And so just in the interest of time, I want to make sure we get to some other stuff, right? So there's a nice example from Groupon, which, right, I got very early good positive feedback. Sort of what they saw were a bunch of different paths forward. They ended up choosing one that kind of narrowed them in on, in some sense, not the best customers, right? And they did okay. They were very quick to be $1 billion company, but were unable to make a really sustainable growth business out of it after that. Okay. And so the key here, right, is that when you really think about the choices facing entrepreneurs, and of course, entrepreneurs face multiple critical choices, but the fact that entrepreneurs are not constrained by the past, by what they're currently doing in their big company, means they have lots of freedom. Also, relative to big company, they have lots of constraint. And so they need a much more active plan for how to search and choose among alternative strategies. But they face lots of uncertainty, and they're trying to narrow that down to kind of validate and kind of de-risk certain parts, but also kind of understand what kind of space they're in. And the learning that they do, though extremely valuable, is ultimately pretty noisy. So that's going to lead to this That's going to mean that what they're going to be able to do is what that results in, right, is in what we call a test two, choose one process. That, right? So of course, the first step in entrepreneurship is that learning and experimentation, talking with customers, working on the product, kind of looking at different configurations. But you're never going to find the one true path. Most often, what you're going to do is be able to identify some meaningful paths forward. And then it's going to be less about the learning and experimentation that tells you what to do, but by looking actually what you're trying to achieve as an entrepreneur, what your team, what your specific team, what your objectives are, what your advantages are, and what might even be the nearest term way to kind of get started to actually get some traction so that you can do this effectively. Okay. So in the interest of time, right? And so kind of, right, so in some sense, what that does is it creates a meaningful gap between optimization and choice, right? So when you think about it, most of you have probably taken economics courses. And when you take an economics course, right, you solve for the monopoly pricing problem, and there's one answer. Well, actually, on the exam, there are a few answers. That's how we give grades, right? But actually, within entrepreneurship, we should embrace the idea that there is a certain amount of optimization goes on. We can deselect the bad options. We can take the power of learning and experimentation, but ultimately, we're making choices that are highly uncertain, looking at different paths forward. Entrepreneurial strategy is about choosing among alternative paths for an idea and company. And so in all the work that we do, we kind of synthesize that into three principles, as I talked about before. Choice matters, these choices matter, and these choices matter together. And I'll talk a little bit about those as we go. So let's imagine you have an idea. So any comments, questions? Talk about what we're doing so far, so good? Any thoughts?
Very fine, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, perfect. Okay. So let's imagine that you have an idea. That's the big light bulb. I like this icon because it has like your DNA in the inside, like the filament. It's like an old style light bulb, right? So you have your idea and that's an entrepreneur, an idea and themselves. And imagine you can see a path forward, a strategy, if you make some investment. And we know a lot about that. Probably most of you taken some finance courses. We know a lot about that, right? We kind of calculate the net present value and we try to think about the value of the investment relative to the cost. In fact, we know so much about that problem is that we know that what we would really like to do is actually first do a little test before we fully commit to the idea. We might call that a real options approach, right? Where we spend a little bit of money to learn a little bit about whether or not this path is valuable. And then if we get good news, then we get the rest of the money, or we commit the rest of the money, and we pursue the path, okay? And that's a very common, in some sense, when you think about the model of venture capital and entrepreneurial finance, that's the kind of model that they have in the back of the head, is we give a little bit of money, the blue light bulb experiment, to do an experiment, the blue light bulb. And then if we get good news, we give you the rest of the money and you get to pursue the strategy. But think about it for a second. If you actually imagine you get bad news. So you thought you had a good idea, you go down the blue light bulb and you sort of say, that's not a good path to go. According to this little graph, according to finance theory, you should actually abandon the venture. But that's not what entrepreneurs do. They try some other path. They go down the red light bulb and the red path, right? But of course, if you've gone too far down the blue path, that makes the red path farther away, right? So it kind of puts a premium on, right, learning and experimentation that also leaves your options for alternative paths open. In other words, relative to just learning about the one path you're thinking about, we need to integrate strategy and experimentation, understanding that if we go too far down one path that actually forecloses some of our other options. Probably the most common pattern we see among growth-oriented entrepreneurs is that they undertake what they say is an experiment when it's actually their first strategic commitment. So far, so good? Okay. So what I'm going to do now, okay, oh, and maybe it's worthwhile saying this. There's some very, very nice empirical work. There was a nice article in Management Science just a few years ago by these co-authors over here that really kind of talk about how taking a more deliberative kind of choice-oriented scientific approach to decision-making really helps people make more effective decisions. Okay? So now what I want to do is draw out the implications of that for specific decisions and then put that together as part of an overall entrepreneurial strategy. So let's think about probably the most foundational choice an entrepreneur makes, which is who is their customer? How do we choose, right? Your customers obviously have to choose you, but equally, if you're pursuing a good opportunity, you're going to face multiple, right, potential customer segments. So this is my favorite little graphic. This is Pratt's healing ointment for man and beast, right? We both use it. That's not choosing your customer. If you're selling a product and it's both for the horse and for your grandpa, you probably haven't done enough customer choice yet. Okay. So everyone talks about what we have to do is we have to find our beachhead. That's really, I'm sure you teach that in class. Go after the beachhead. We have to find the beachhead for your entrepreneurial venture. The question is, why? Why can't we just go to the biggest mainstream market or not really, just put the product online and hope for the best? And the reason is grounded in something that's a real fact, which is what's called the market S-curve, right? This notion of diffusion, right? That for most products and services, almost all, when you start to get going, it goes very slow, then there's a big adoption, and then it sort of tails off. There's kind of a classical, right, Zvi Grillicus, right, looking at the adoption of hybrid corn in the middle of the 20th century. What you can see is that in each U.S. state, Iowa, Wisconsin, Kentucky, so on and so forth, you see these big S-curves by state, and if you just do it as well for the whole United States, it's a big S-curve. And moreover, it's not just a fact, this kind of slow process of going from the beachhead to the mainstream, right? We have kind of a theory of why this works. It's because there's different types of adopters, from the innovators and early adopters to the early majority, late majority, and so forth. But at the same time, right, there are practitioners such as Jeff Moore who are very thoughtful about that whole process. And what Jeff Moore did is he sort of said, what he notices in most firms is that this is a real process to be managed. And the big problem that many startups face is this crossing the chasm, right? They find it, they get some traction with some early adopters, but they're unable to make it to the mainstream. Well, you should get kind of worried if I, on the one hand, tell you that something is an inevitable law of nature, a fact. It's going to happen. This market S-curve just happens. But it also depends on our choices as entrepreneurs and managers. Right? It really kind of makes you think, where does that S-curve really come from? What choices result in a market S-curve for a given idea? So just kind of sharpen that. I'm going to give you an answer, right? Let me kind of give you one little kind of thought about that, right? Is about a number of years ago in Silicon Valley, there were two startups. They were literally founded in like 1 month of each other and literally within 2 miles of each other, like very close. And they were both the same idea. They were basically like a Fitbit, right? Kind of a sort of tracker, fitness tracker around the neck. And one was for kind of medium high-end women's fashion called Misfit Wearables. Other, exactly the same tech, Whistle for the dog. And so I can kind of imagine a world where I start in women's fashion and I make it over to pet accessories. But I literally cannot imagine a world where I start in pet accessories and make my way over to women's fashion. Maybe I'm right. Why do I tell you that story? Because it actually tells you where the market S-curve really comes from. Is that for a given idea, there's not a beachhead. There's not a market S-curve. There are multiple S-curves for a given idea. And the choice of beachhead shapes the mainstream you get. Just kind of push that. Right? Just push that. Excuse me. Here's two leading practitioners whose advice many startups follow. And so one is Jeff Moore, Crossing the Chasm. Some of you might have read that book. And his key advice is choose what you want to do as a startup is you want to find the most influential, hard to reach early adopters. So if you want to start a social media site, you want to get Kim Kardashian, or somebody like that, right? Some very famous person. You want those hard to reach early adopters who are highly influential on subsequent adopters. Other person over here is Clay Christensen, unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but Clay's work was about choosing poorly served customers who are non-consuming and no one cares about. Find the people that no one else cares about. Well, they're not going to be right. Now, my point is not that one is right and one is wrong, but those are different pieces of advice. Each of them potentially valuable. Each of them might allow you to go along one S-curve or the other with different dynamics, but they're not the same beachheads. If you are pursuing a good idea, you'll have multiple viable beachheads, and the choice of beachhead shapes the mainstream you get. Okay. So we then kind of put that out, right? We then go through customer, technology and innovation, organization, team. We put that together as part of an overall framework that we call the Entrepreneurial Strategy Compass, where we organize around this choice of competition. And basically on the x-axis, we have the choice that I talked about before, that choice between do you collaborate with the big firms or compete with them? And you're more focused on the control of your idea or the execution of that idea, okay? And that yields 4 distinctive entrepreneurial strategies, right? So on the one hand, right, if you collaborate with an orientation towards control, we call that an intellectual property strategy. You can kind of imagine, right? Think of kind of the right example there, right? But for example, you might imagine that what you do there is you're going to be big on licensing. You're going to be kind of build a small team that really understands what problem they're solving, very good at technology transfer, kind of a lean and mean organization that understands how to get the job done for the industry. Could take exactly the same idea, right? So there's a compass, not a map, and you can consider a disruption strategy where you're competing with those very same firms you might have collaborated with and executing rather than focusing on control and IP. And so there you might imagine you're kind of doing the lean startup, you're kind of finding customers that no one cares about, you're kind of really kind of disrupting everything. You're avoiding the big firms. You can imagine pursuing a value chain strategy where you engage with big firms on a more collaborative, not really on an AP basis, but on the basis of your team and your problem solving. Once again, around that same idea. And then the most ambitious strategy is what we call the architectural strategy. That's the one where you focus on control while you're competing. And I'll send around these slides. We have kind of, once again, lots of materials around this and different companies that you might imagine. When you think of like the disruption strategy, you might think of a company like Salesforce that many of you might know, right? When you think about a value chain strategy, a company like Foxconn that kind of solves for a layer of the value chain, architectural strategy, company like OpenTable. The key is not, right? The key is not that one strategy is better than the other. It's that different entrepreneurial strategies involve different priorities and commitments, right? So for example, a value chain strategy means integrating your innovation into the existing value chain, reinforcing the value proposition of already existing customers, right? You're looking at exclusive relationships and focusing on a single layer. Disruptive strategy is you're focusing on not the current customers, but on customer segments that are poorly served. Exploiting the new technology S-curve through the development of a novel value chain rather than building on the existing value chain. But you need to execute quickly in order to avoid competitive response. Okay, so I'm going to kind of finish up with just one or two little pieces here, right? I could actually, yeah, I think we have just enough time, right? So you think about who this is? Right, you might think this is Mickey Mouse, but it's not. This is Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. It was Disney's first great creation. And Disney actually, he had a very simple idea that animation was for children. And Oswald the Lucky Rabbit was the instantiation of that idea. It was the character. He had a partner, Charles Mintz, who would then distribute the movies. He built a great team to bring Oswald to life. But the problem was that Mr. Mintz turned out to be a terrible partner. And so he wouldn't give him money. He was kind of whatever, right? Disney took a train trip from California to New York to renegotiate his contract with Mr. Mintz. When he got there, Mr. Mintz looked at him and said, I don't know why you're here. I love to, good seeing you, Walt. But I love Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. He's very popular. And I love your team. But I'm not sure why I'm talking with you. See, actually, while we're going to form a new company, I've actually hired away half of your team, and we're going to build a new company that's going to pursue this idea of family-oriented animation. And let me go, that was a good team. They created Bugs Bunny, Woody Woodpecker, Bugs Bunny, Looney Tunes. And then he said, also, not only are you a mere entrepreneur, but you're not a particularly good entrepreneur. In fact, it's actually me, Mr. Mintz, when you signed the contract with me, you gave me the copyright to Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. You thought we're just collaborating, but I control the IP, and I'm going to knock you out of the deal. Now, many people might have had that meeting and say, I'd better go back to, in this case, for Walt Disney, Kansas City, and find another line of work, or maybe go work for Mr. Mintz or something like that, but not remain as an entrepreneur. But Disney understood that the fact that his idea had gotten stolen, the fact that Mintz was sort of really screwing him over, that actually meant that he had a good idea, but a bad strategy. And he went back and he wrote in his diary that he had to put in place, he had to create an innovation, an invention, so that no one could ever control his company or his characters again. And so what he did is within literally 3 months. Oh, there's an iPhone. Oh, maybe we can. Okay, yeah, okay. Right? Is within 3 months, he invented sound cartoons, Steamboat Willie, of which Mickey Mouse was the star, and created this bond between, right? And so that, in some sense, gives you a flavor of kind of how entrepreneurial strategy works, right? That time with Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, that was more like that value chain strategy. That strategy didn't quite work out, and it was really close to the bankruptcy, but then he was able to just make the move towards building out that architectural strategy that became the strategy of the Disney company for the next century. Okay, I'll finish up in just 2 seconds, right? So just to back really quickly, right? I told you about those different alternative strategies for Michael Martin at RapidSOS. There's us. That was the entire company at the time we were working with them. And right, they really went through this process. And what they ultimately did is they actually chose the least economically viable strategy in the near term, which was working with the kind of what they called the burning platform, the domestic violence and the epilepsy association. But that was a good test case for them. And it opened them up to many other possibilities. Since then, RapidSOS now has become the standard within the United States on both iOS and on Android for both Apple and Google for management of emergency response calls. They manage more than 350 911 calls per year, working with local agencies to improve that. That's created a great underlying business for them, as well as one of their key metrics is the internal metric that they are able to assess is the number of lives they save per day through their innovation and through their entrepreneurial strategy. Okay. Happy to chat for a minute or two. I have another meeting in just a few minutes, but we have tons and tons of materials. This was just a really high-level overview of some of the kind of work we're doing around entrepreneurial strategy. Once again, Tugba, I'd love to work with you or your students around bringing this material into your classroom. There's lots and lots of materials. And any thoughts and comments?
Thank you. Yeah.
You didn't think I'd make it through, did you?
Excuse me?
You didn't think I'd make it through all the slides?
I think you cut some of them.
I did. I did. It was this. Usually I either do an hour and a half, but either way, it'll work.
Okay, so can we ask questions? Are you done with slides? Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. We enjoyed a lot, and I have been the department chair for 5 years, and I believe that I have given an excellent service. And this presentation is also the example of the contributions that I make to the university, and I appreciate that you are our host, you are our guest, basically. And could you please also lead us? How should leaders, focus on corporate entrepreneurship? We talk about ordinary entrepreneurship. So how could leaders lead their employees for corporate entrepreneurship? Could you give us some insights about it? Yeah, absolutely. So I'll say one or two little things, if that's okay. So the first and really easy part is so there's sort of few layers. The first is when we started this work, we had the insight or the approach that there were lots of tools for big companies, and there were actually very few tools for entrepreneurs. And so what we've really tried to do is develop building on both practice, other research, also some of that integrative synthesis that we've been able to do to derive a concrete set of worksheets and tools for entrepreneurs for their own use. We have also found, which has been very, we found it very, encouraging, that many of our students are able to take this back to their corporates. And in particular, on the one hand, there's less, a corporate has more resources, isn't quite as constrained, but they have a little bit less freedom because they have, they can't compete against themselves. There's organizational issues and so on. But very often the core insight that what you're trying to do is promulgate that good strategy comes from concretely surfacing multiple alternatives, doing tests and experiments, and really engaging in experimentation and learning that lets you see what a few of those alternatives might look like. But then your choices really mean not finding necessarily the best solution, but maybe the best for you. Does that make sense? That's a global, right? That makes sense because it allows you to pursue that allows you to see how you and your team are best able to make an impact, right? Even though that other strategy that you looked at might also be viable for a different team or for a different moment. Do you see what I'm saying? So relative traditional strategy making, where in some sense we almost implicitly say that the goal is to find the best, this is more about seeing different futures, understanding them. Of course, there's still going to be uncertainty, but really then being able to make some meaningful trade-offs about how that's going to be resolved on strategy A versus strategy B. The only other thing I would say is that I think the entrepreneurial strategy framework centers the role that individuals play in strategy.
right? So I've been fortunate to work with Mike Porter for 25 years on many projects and activities. But when you think about like Mike Porter type strategy or the resource-based view of the firm, that's kind of like who the leader is and who the decision maker is doesn't matter. Right? Strategy and leadership are like just two different topics. Here's the strategy of the firm. Why does leader matter? And then, of course, when you go into real organizations, of course, who the people are matters. Right? And so one thing this perspective gives you by looking at that test to choose one and grounding it in the capabilities of the individuals, kind of human scale decision making, human scale leadership and choice. Do you see what I'm saying? That tells you that who you are matters. So I actually had a series of slides that I did delete that there are on that. So we did one study, for example, that looked at for otherwise equivalent ventures. Some of them had a faculty member involved. These were faculty student publications that then sometimes just the faculty was involved, or sometimes the faculty and the students were involved, and sometimes only the students. And the ones where faculty were involved, even though everything else was the same, the faculty ones were much more IP-oriented, much more control-oriented, but they were much slower. The student ones were much more execution-oriented, less IP, but much faster. Okay, so there was a trade-off between speed and control. And then you say, okay, well, which one was better? Actually looking at, 250 ventures or whatever it was, looking 5-7 years out, the average performance was actually the same for both groups, just different pathways, depending on who was involved. Hope that helped.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from one of our students. Abshir, would you like to ask a question? Maybe you can turn on your camera as well.
Okay. Thank you, Mrs. Sins and Professor Karabulut. I have one question. Okay, so my question is, there is this fear about should we go and finish our MBA or before starting the business, or as you said about Fidget Branson also say go and take action.
Well, that I have an easy question for you, Abshir. Finish your MBA.
Yeah. So
let me go further. As a student, when you are a student, so I'm not saying don't do the venture on the side, right? Right. You might want to do the venture on the side as part of your MBA. In fact, many of our most impactful students, right, they take bunches of classes, and every project they focus on is how to use the materials in the class to move forward the startup. As a student, you're in a very unique position. If you call somebody up and say, I'm working on a student project, and you're a very good university, you can say, oh, I'll talk to you. Once you're out of school, guess what? They're not going to pick up the phone. So, right, being in school lets you talk to customers, lets you get mentors, it lets you work with faculty, it gives you frameworks. Now, of course, that all being said, it's up to you to use those to move forward your venture. But what we observe is that our most impactful ventures among students that are in real time, that are alongside, getting founded while they're in the MBA program are not, we do have some students who have dropped out in the middle, and, then we call them on leave and whatever. And some of those have been successful, but by and large, that's actually been a less successful route. And then just to be honest, the great thing about finishing your MBA while you're pursuing a venture is if a year from now, the venture isn't working, you still have your MBA and can go, right, you can get great jobs out of that. Do you see what I'm saying? So it actually allows you to take more risk in the venture because you have better things to fall back on. And now companies, corporates value, are increasingly valuing people who have done a startup right? MBA plus startup, that's a great combination.
Thank you so much.
No worries.
I will have a last question. What would you suggest to researchers, professors like us? What might be the potential research areas in the field of entrepreneurship?
Right. So I have lots of answers to that. And I hope this, right. But my view is that there's a group of people and, around this broad agenda, we've already gotten a lot of traction on it. There's a lot of complementary research, such as that scientific approach to entrepreneurial decision-making by Alfonso Gambardella and co-authors at Bocconi. My sense is that, my view is that there are two big areas of entrepreneurship research that are really applicable to firms that are the best areas for it. And the first of those is there's no monopoly on our wisdom. I'm open to lots of other ways of thinking about strategic choice making among entrepreneurs. But being concrete, but I do find I think what we do has packaged together a lot of work in a nice frame. Concrete studies of the choices that entrepreneurs make under different decisions, how they learn and experiment, and looking at the consequences of learning and experimentation for choice and performance. That's number one. The second, and let me correct, I do think that we've made enough progress there that there's a very concrete work you can build on, both through case study research as well as large-scale data studies. Did you see what I'm saying? And that's what a lot of our students are doing, lots of other people. The second is we have filled in a good amount, but there's just a tremendous amount to learn about entrepreneurial organizations. How do you build the team? How does the sequencing of who you hire or the construction of the founding team impact strategy, impact performance? How do norms get established? What does leadership look like? So on and so forth. And there, I would say there are some, of course, very nice individual studies, but there isn't kind of a body of work there that is as deep. So when you think about it, there's a lot of work in entrepreneurial finance, and I'm sure there's more to do, but that's an area that's pretty well understood. Entrepreneurial strategy, I would say, customer, go-to-market, tech, innovation, choice. I think we've done some work to bring that work together in the last decade, but there's lots to do, I think, concretely and empirically. And then thirdly, I think the world of entrepreneurial organizations is a world that's worthwhile to kind of look at what's the vistas going forward. I don't even think we have a good framework for entrepreneurial organizations.
Okay, thank you very much. We are very happy that we met with you today.
Absolutely. And I really enjoyed this, and thank you, and feel free, and thank you for the opportunity. It's really great.
And I hope we will have a chance to do some joint research together.
Great.
And we would like to see you in our university whenever you want to come to Turkey.
I would so look forward to one of the great cities of the world. Absolutely.
So thank you very much once
Very
again.
good. Okay.
Thank
See you guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Teşekkür